There are so many multilingual ideas going through my head. One, embarras de richesse, and the other, for the two Scandinavian speakers in the room, a smorgasbord of possibilities, is that everything is out there. So you've got to find some themes, and I'd like to choose one, and Leigh has taken some notes as well. Michael is asked to chip in. But, that said, one of the theories of the layout of this room was not quite successful because you have to have a proscenium when you're looking at presentations, is that every chair can see every other. Okay? So everybody has a sight line to everybody else in the room. Wish cameras were like that. But anyway, we've got two to try and encapsulate the entire group as a group. I originally wanted there to be 4 quadrants, but it doesn't quite work. Anyway, enough. One of the themes, I think, is how we capture subjectivity for further discussion. Because if analysis is about understanding, and nobody's going to completely understand subjectivity, there could be a good discussion around that. So I'm throwing that idea out. Leigh has some, what he called random thoughts, which I'm sure are not random, Leigh.
Well, some of them are summaries, some of them might have been said before we started, and they're all very, very short, so I'm not here to do a big monologue. The first thing is, I think it's worth mentioning, although that shouldn't constrain you in the remarks that you make in the discussion, that our project is looking at analysis from the listener's point of view. It's been implied but not stated, because there are others, and most traditional analysis is based on a score, or a composer's notes, or both, and that's not our main interest. We're not ignoring it, but we're not focusing on that. The second thing I want to say is an apology, because John Young mentioned something that was absolutely apropos, but it was due to an ambiguity on our part, namely, which genres was referring indeed to genres, but people were not invited to discuss genres. Acousmatic music is a category. Sound art is a category. 85+% of the names on the genres and categories listed here are categories. We don't have very many genres, in fact. And that is an interesting thing that we need to actually tackle here.
Probably me got that wrong, actually.
Not to worry. I did really appreciate remarks made by several people reaching out into areas beyond music for methods or means of analysis. Analysis is traditionally rather self-referential, not exclusively, but often the case. And as we're in an interdisciplinary field, we need to engage with that. I'm thrilled beyond words that many people who came up and talked this morning discussed social dimensions, socio-cultural dimensions. The word ethnomusicologist fell in the discussion. For years I've been screaming and yelling about that as part of the analytical horizon, and I think electroacoustic music really calls out for that. Now, poor Owen was put in a terrible position because he had an A and B subject, where B is what he really does. Mm-hmm. I'm going to just raise one question on algorithmic music, because it was there on the list, which I've published before, just food for thought. If you can't hear it, what is its role? And if the composer doesn't articulate anything about that role, then why do I have to read all those computer music journal articles about the algorithm that I can't do? We didn't call anybody up for visual music, and I think that was a mistake on our part, because I just want to say that that does form part of it. There are many 2D and 3D aspects of this. And the final remark I want to make goes back to a book that many of you haven't seen because its distribution isn't very good, that I wrote after writing the MIT book. At the end of the Sounds of Music, the Music of Sounds, rather. God, I'm getting dyslexic. That was what I wanted to name the next book, and it was forbidden, because Rodgers and Hammerstein might just get at me. In the Music of Sounds at the end, I talk about the classification of works as a more than one-dimensional thing. Think of a Google search. And I think that this holds true for a lot of aspects in analysis as well, that we think there is a way of grabbing that information or of classifying that information. And I think that often there are several ways that all individually and collectively can contribute to greater understandings. And so this idea of a multidimensional approach or a transdisciplinary approach, et cetera, that was a through line in the first hour or two this morning, and I think it was very valuable. And I'll stop there.
Right. Well, that's still an embarras de richesse. I'd like to set the ball rolling with the question I asked, or perhaps one of the questions Leigh asked. Which one would you like to put first? What would be the first topic of discussion for the entire group?
Could I offer?
Yes.
Could I
right.
offer a large meta comment?
Yeah.
Before we go into the specifics, because I want to pick up right off where Simon Atkinson ended, where he asked, "Why are we running around in circles? And is it time to radically reassess our questions?" But it's interesting, almost none of the presentations this morning said what questions were trying to be answered. And I think this is fundamental. Coming up in the academic setting of music, quite often we've been in analysis classes where that question's never been raised. Sometimes the students say, "Why are we doing this?" And often the answers have not been very convincing in my experience. And yet it's the most fundamental question we can ask. So some people said in the presentation, well, for analysis of this area, it has to include X. Well, the only way you can say that, in order to be complete, this was the implication, in order to be complete, analysis has to include this. Well, analysis is always incomplete. Analysis is a map. It is not the territory. You choose different kinds of maps for a territory depending on what it is you're trying to achieve. One map helps you drive between towns. Another map helps you know where to cross all the nice paths through the fields. Another map displays to you the different levels of the heights in the territory to help guide mineral exploration, right? You have to know what the map is for before you can decide what has to be on that map. It's the most important question, and yet we keep dodging it. So even if we accept that we're going to make subjectivity the core, which I think is wonderful, we still have to ask, okay, what are we asking about subjectivity?
Further themes. Georgina.
Well, just the most obvious point following on, which really makes the thing difficult. So I'm not trying to be constructive or helpful here. But of course, subjectivity is not one thing. So we also then have to distinguish between normative accounts of subjectivity, which I think is what's going on here, and real subjectivity, which is multiple and which is very much inflected, as many people have been saying, by sociological and cultural dimensions of experience and of life ways. So then we have a really interesting problem. But if it's the normative, because the second one takes us into ethnographies of listening and so on, which is interesting, but it raises new questions methodologically too. If we're talking normative accounts of subjectivity, that is also a rather confined undertaking, but it's a more doable one.
How do you capture it?
With someone else.
Not on a video camera. How? John and Neil, we were presented with a performance, in a sense. We could have been videoing the performance, looking at it. How are we capturing? I said to Pierre in one of our discussions about the software, should we have tracks to track the brainwaves, the subcortical things that are happening within us? But that's a very objective way of thinking about personal response to the music. How can we capture?
But it is a legitimate way of doing it as well. Not the one, but it is a legitimate way of capturing reaction.
Yeah. So we could certainly stripe in physical, quasi-physical, measurable things. Then that's the controversial point. Then they're just measurable objects. They're not giving you. They're giving you something about the response. How else might we capture the subjective? So we're also keen on it, but where is it? Yeah, Odit.
I want to throw a wrench at it. I think once we capture something and we say this is subjectivity, we will automatically say no, it's not, just because it is captured. And as a sort of, there were some recent studies that were able to sort of do kind of mind reading, reconstruct from brain scans what people are actually seeing. And it's a fairly accurate representation of what the people are actually looking at just by MRI scan. And which is, 10 years ago we would have said this captures subjective experience. But once you actually do it, you say no, it isn't. Because once it's not us, I think we fail to recognize it as subjective.
That almost might be built into the meaning of the word. My question.
And I think it's the same thing with, I think, like creativity. Once a computer does something, we say it's no longer creativity, even though, or you know, playing chess. You know, playing chess used to be, you know, the most human, complicated thing. And once computer did it, they did not become intelligent. They're just as dumb as they were 10 years ago. They just beat us at chess. So we moved the goalpost of what does being intelligent mean. So I think.
So you think that it's forever going to slip out of our grasp?
I suspect so.
I do want to ask Catherine at that point. You were just about to say something, because you have written about your subjective responses to music, and you do beautifully constructed narratives using different fonts and so on, which you and I have discussed often. How can we go beyond your experience, and how do you feel the role of what you write about your subjective response is with respect to all the other subjects in this room?
Okay, can I put that there?
Yeah, do. Go for another one. Yes, go on.
I don't know if I can answer that or if it would be very important, actually. I think you can, I mean, I'm using subjectivity in a very loose way. I'm not a philosopher and I'm using it in a colloquial term, but the kinds of brain scan revelations, and I've read that research and it's been really interesting, that shows the way that we dream and think that can be somehow quantified or at least located in the brain. It's still subjective, it's to do with subjective experience in a way. We sometimes seem to talk about subjectivity and individual experience, personal experience, as if they're the same thing. And I don't think they're quite interchangeable, really. I'm not saying that one's worse than the other. And so I suppose coming to the individual or personal experience, which is something I'm really quite interested in exploring as a way of writing about sound and listening, or if I hammer on about, is an approach which I've become quite interested in looking at it in other contexts, is what's sometimes called auto-ethnography, which is ethnographic study which doesn't attempt, in fact celebrates the ethnographer's personal investment in the thing that they are writing about, and then uses personal experience to extrapolate more generally. And I think that's where it's really important to me that you then do that, and that's a form of scholarly research as much as ethnography, that it's not simply diaristic or personal reflection, which there's nothing wrong with, but it doesn't necessarily reveal much. So I guess my mission is to look at ways of writing about sonic and listening experience that don't minimise but in fact celebrate the personal, but ways of people thinking and using that method in revelatory and ways that will grow. Can I stop now?
Yes, you can, but I'd like to ask others, but not Catherine. Can we ever get beyond the personal experience? In that sense, we're all just case studies. Is there? How do you share things, Michael?
But just before coming on to that, I want to say a bit like Georgina's question, but from a different angle, is which subjectivity, particularly talking about the monitoring brainwaves and so on. I mean, is it the brainwaves of someone as they listen to the piece for the first time, when they listen to a piece when they know it really well, or is it even when they're listening at all? I mean, some of my deepest experiences of music are post-listening reflection, and that's all part of musical experience. And that's where I think some of the limitations of this data can be, unless you're going to sort of monitor someone's brainwaves over a very long period of time, then know which bits are when they're thinking about the music and which are when they're not. So that's one thing. On the other thing that you're asking about, if we can get beyond the personal individual's response, I suppose the way to do that, which I know you've done in a slightly different context, Leigh, already, is to take a group of subjects and to see how they respond, and then take data from that. But again, you come back to the same question: is are you trying to go for the naive listener encountering a work for the first time? Do you want someone who's thought and listened to it many times and considered it, not necessarily intellectually, but in some way considered the work in depth? Or what stage you're going to take this information?
Experience.